Everybody, we're gonna get started here. A few minutes early, hopefully, if you want to kind of come in. There is more sandwiches and more water, so help yourself. If you get parched, feel free to pop out. This should be a pretty casual, fun event. So before that, we are very glad you're here. My name is JC Lucas, and I am with Atlanta Ventures, and we are running Simply SaaS. So Simply SaaS is a community of SaaS professionals that are coming together to either further your company or your career, and we're just here to help you succeed. So what are these things that we're doing? We host meetups, we host forums, and then we host university, aka why you are here. So this is basically, we're trying to inspire SaaS professionals to connect. We're trying to help them learn and be inspired. So why are you here? I want to challenge you for 3 minutes to find someone you probably had an opportunity to connect with who you're sitting with, but I'd like for you to turn to someone you do not know and tell them why you're here. Go. Awesome. Well, hopefully you guys were able to connect with someone. Our goal is always to bring people together and cultivate good community amongst the SaaS people of Atlanta and the Southeast. So, without further ado, I do want to introduce Josh Siegel. Let's give him a hand. So, this is Project Management 101. He has plenty to tell you about his story, so I'm not going to even dive in. He has more authority on that than I do. So, I will switch these over if you're ready.
Sure.
And pop your...
I have lots of weird pictures that I shamelessly stole off the internet for you.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it. I kind of have to stay here so that the camera can hear me, unfortunately. Otherwise, I'd love to kind of walk around. I want to keep it loose. I want to keep it flexible. I want to hear what you all are interested in. I'm going to consider this entire thing in alpha because I've never done this before. So I want your feedback, and there'll be a survey tomorrow. So the outline's pretty simple. It's going to start with a who are you, and then a who am I? And then what is product management and what do PMs do? And I'm going to throw some of those best practices that I've learned over the years in here. And at any point, I want to just stop, take questions. We can go off on weird tangents. We can go wherever you all want to go, right? That's what I'm excited to do today. So who are you? Who are you? Who's a founder right now of a startup? That is a lot of the room. Okay. How many people in here are product managers? Awesome. That's actually a lot of the room. That's great. How many people in here are in marketing? Okay. We got a little less. Sales. Okay. All right, so we got a nice cross-section. Something that I did not say. Engineering. Awesome. Yeah. And how do you forget the engineers as a product manager? Big mistake number one. Come on. How many folks work for a company by themselves? They are the company. One person. Okay. 2 to 5. All right, there we go. 5 to 10. 10 to 50. 50 to 39,682. Okay, there we go. So we're skewing on the smaller side. We've got lots of entrepreneurs. Some folks who are product managers. Can just a couple of people call out, raise your hand, whatever, and just let me know, what are you hoping to leave the room with today that you didn't know coming in? Non-rhetorical, yeah.
How does a product manager interact with all the different functions?
Oh, come on, you're just freaking teeing me up. How does a product manager interact with all the different functions? You saw the slides ahead of time. Who else? How do you plan? That's great. And I'm not getting into that much, but we can totally sidebar on it because it's actually a really interesting conversation. Yeah.
I was interested in hearing what you had to say about the MVP.
MVP. Never heard of it. So we'll try to figure that out. Yeah.
Something with baseball.
Yeah, I know. I have that joke in there. Duh. Everyone's stealing my thunder today. All right. Yeah, in the back.
How to manage the expectations of like the sales team?
Yep.
As well as the engineering team?
That's great. I have a few slides on that. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of going off the MVP, how to prioritize features at first, and then maybe the next thing, and the next thing of building off the MVP, where to go next.
Yep. How do you prioritize features and have things build on one another? And I actually have a great slide that I stole from Spotify on that some of you may know.
What about user feedback? How you integrate user feedback back into the product?
that you all are going to try during this session, because we've got 2 exercises that are actually planned in here, and we'll see how they go. Hopefully you have something to write with. We didn't actually say that beforehand, a computer or something, but you'll actually be thinking a bit about how to incorporate user feedback into your own challenges. Sure.
Organizational culture based on agile or something else.
Great. Organizational culture, agile, how to integrate that.
How do you lead or manage without actual authority?
Leading and managing without actual authority, which is the key aspect of product management. These are awesome. I wish I had surveyed you beforehand. We may not get to everything, but I do want to get to as much as possible, and hopefully even leave time for questions, or we can kind of veer off the content and just have a conversation. So again, let's just talk. All right, so the who am I has the subtext, which is why am I here and listening to you? Do you actually have any credibility? I'm going to try to demonstrate that I have some credibility. It's mostly that I've been in tech for over 20 years, which officially in most rooms makes me kind of an old guy, and I'm cool with that. I was in the dot-com crash and all that fun stuff. I could tell you about those moments. And I'm now a director at Salesforce in product management, working on Pardot, which is the company David founded that eventually led to Atlanta Tech Village, and I believe Atlanta Ventures and everything else. And my job is principally to integrate Pardot, which is a marketing automation platform, into Salesforce. And that is challenging, so I can tell you a bit more about that. I am also an advisor at the Atlanta Tech Village. So tomorrow, I go there for my office hours from 10 to noon, and anyone who is a village member just comes and talks to me about what's their challenges, what are their MVPs, what are they looking at, and I do my best to advise. I'm going to subject you to my resume as quickly as humanly possible, so you just have some idea. I did computer science in undergrad at Brown, which basically meant I lived in this room, which has no windows, for hours and hours and hours a week, smashing my head against a Sun Solaris screen. That's the actual room. I then went into consulting and flew on a plane all over the place for a long time. I don't necessarily recommend it as a way to get into product or anything else. It's not the most scalable business in the world, but I did learn a lot doing it. At that point, I decided, hey, why don't I burn a lot of money? So I went to business school at Kellogg, which is a fantastic way to make friends. MBA stands for, yes, mediocre but ambitious. And mostly it was about playing in a band and drinking, which is me over here on the left-hand side of this photo. Seriously, it's fun. You're basically playing to all your best friends, like great concerts. And from there, somehow I convinced Google to hire me as a product manager. So I cut my teeth in product at Google. This is what Google looked like at the time that I joined. You'll see the copyright 2006 there. And I started on the core infrastructure team, basically working on MapReduce, Borg, all these crazy things that have kind of come to define a lot of the open source and tech industry that have kind of been pivoted out. The biggest thing that I did there, however, was I joined the mobile team right before the launch of Android and iPhone. And I actually introduced into the Google Core Search Index lat-long location for the first time. So prior to 2006 or 2007, if you search for zoo and you were in San Diego and you search for zoo and you're in the Bronx, you'd get the same results, and that's ridiculous. So we took, cell ID, Wi-Fi, and GPS level granular location, and we put it into the search index. And now this is used, of course, billions of times a day, which is pretty cool. From there, I pivoted to YouTube, partially because I was getting really sick of the commute from San Francisco to Mountain View, and there I worked on some of the coolest things I've ever done in my career. I launched live streaming, so I turned YouTube from kind of an upload VOD platform into a live streaming platform, which hosted Barack Obama, amongst other fantastic guests, Coachella, all sorts of concerts. And then the video editor in the cloud, and I got to meet all the YouTube celebrities who you have never heard of, and trust me, you wish if you have, I'm really sorry about that. Then I got married, and my wife got a phenomenal job working for the CDC as a field agent in Los Angeles, so we moved down to LA, and I just happened to find a job with Hulu, and I ran all of their video streaming technology. So if anyone is doing video, anything, want us to talk FFmpeg, MPEG-Dash, transcoding farms, CDN distribution, quality of service, I could talk about that stuff. It's cool stuff. But of course, you were wondering, well, did you just do all these big companies, raised a fortune, blah, blah, blah? No, I did a startup. Basically, I said, okay, honey, we're going to go back to the city, San Francisco, the heart of it, we're going to do a startup. And I joined a crazy little startup called Cognitive Networks that had 9 people as the VP of product. And this was one of these startups that is implementing the technology so your TV can watch you. It was called Smart TV Automatic Content Recognition. I'm not going to tell you the whole story because it was insane, but we basically raised $27 million and we burned it by giving it to AWS. We ran out of money, got sued out of existence, and got acquired for pennies on the dollar. So I've had startup experience, a little different than most other startup experience. I learned an enormous amount. There was something I learned in business school called Porter's 5 Forces. Has anyone heard of that? Okay, a couple of you have, about supplier power, buyer power. That stuff is real. When I learned it in Strategy 101, I was like, this is completely hypothetical. No, it's not. It's very, very real. You'll know that when your buyers control you. At that point, I was selling television data into the ad tech industry. And I was like, ad tech industry, the entire internet is supported by ads. And I have no idea how they work. So why don't I pivot and actually expose myself to ad tech? And that's what I did. I became a director at AdRoll, which is one of the leading kind of mid-market retargeting platforms. And I learned the entire suite of the ad tech industry, which is incredibly complicated and can basically be distilled into one slogan, which is you're either Google, Facebook, or their slave. That's what I learned in ad tech. But I met fantastic people. AdRoll is still a great company. It's just really, really hard to be a reseller for Facebook. And then basically my wife said, hey, I'm kind of looking to do something bigger. You know, the CDC headquarters is in Atlanta. And I'm like, Atlanta? The entire time I've been in San Francisco. And so I came out here and I checked it out. I went here for 1 week, my entire life, and then said, sure, let's move the entire family out here. And I got a job with Salesforce as a director on Pardot. So this is the Pardot Lightning app. We just launched this on Monday. This was the big thing I stood up at Dreamforce and waved my arms around like this at a couple weeks ago. And it is the initial integration of Pardot into Salesforce. I'm definitely not going to bore you with Lightning. The best thing about Salesforce is they give me the opportunity to do things like this, right? I can come and volunteer. I can talk to people. I can volunteer at ATV. I volunteer for Democratic campaigns. And so it's been a phenomenal opportunity to kind of branch out and meet folks and do stuff for fun. All right, it's over. You can all relax, we're done. Back to the topic, what is product management? So if you had to sum up product management in one word, what would it be? Empathy, I like that's better than my word. That's great. That's much closer to my word. My word was what, with Y on the bottom, so you caught it. Did you see my slides before? I just added this. We're gonna go, so basically this talk, you know, JC's like, hey, do you want to come? I'm like, sure. What am I talking about? Product management. Okay, and I have to figure out what am I gonna talk about. It forced me to come up with a framework for what I do every day and have been doing for the last 12 years. That's basically what we're gonna talk about is that framework today. But if I had to encapsulate the full job of product management as simply as possible, it's literally that. It's you as the product manager have to say, what are we going to build? What is the product, right? You're also going to have to know why, right? Because you need strategic alignment or you can't get the resources and the support you need to build the product. What you're not supposed to do, and a mistake I've made many times in my product career, talk to my VPs of engineering, is answer the question how, right? It's the engineer's job to answer the question how you're going to build it. Right? So this is if, you know, when all else fails and when you're kind of lost in the sea in product management, you kind of come back to this base principle, right? What is the product supposed to be, right? And of course, that's going to depend on all the things we're about to talk about. The other thing I decided to do was just Google product manager to see what came up. Because who knows, I told you I just stole all this stuff off the internet shamelessly. And this is the image that came up. And I actually think that this is apropos for a number of reasons. I don't know, maybe it's what you think of when you think of product. It's flailing arms, juggling a million different things. You got the glasses, so it's kind of nerdy, but you can pull off the suit, right? You can kind of pull off the jacket when you need to, when you got to have some credibility and get up on stage in front of people. And so we're just going to use this guy as our kind of product manager and put him in the middle of the framework. What is the framework? Yes, what is the framework? So when you're the product manager, in order to kind of get to that what, you become the center of an ongoing conversation. And that conversation evolves as all new information comes in. And you have constituent parties all around you that offer that information, change the landscape, et cetera. But in the role, and this is the reason that I love this role, you are the anchor point, you're the center of that conversation. So who are you talking to? Well, you're talking to your engineering teams and your UX teams. Who knows what UX means? Yell it. It means user experience, yes. UX, the people who do designs, they do mocks, but it's more than that. You know, in many cases, it's user experience research, right? When you work for a big company like Salesforce, I get Kim Campbell, who is phenomenal and does whole user experience research projects for us. At certain companies I've been at, it's blown out, and there's someone for information architecture, someone for copy, et cetera. And of course, engineering, which is your tightest relationships, where you have front-end engineers, back-end engineers, database, et cetera. So what is this relationship? How does it work? Fundamentally, as a product manager, you're acting as a guide, right? Someone once told me, like, think of the engineering team as like the Energizer Bunny. You wind them up, and you're just going to let them go. They're going to go, right? And it's just going to kind of, you know, and this is whether it's an in-house team, whether you're an entrepreneur and you're like, oh, I'll just outsource this to India, or like outsource it to rural sourcing or whatever it is. You know, that team is just going to go, and they're going to go based on the assumptions they have about the thing that they think you want them to build. And the art of this is having these conversations and developing these relationships to put those guardrails in and explain, no, this is what we want. This is the hypothesis. This is where we want to go. And if you do that correctly or do it well, or even if you don't do it well, you get back a product, right? And that is kind of the fundamental unit of what you're attempting to do, right? It's the what that you've been trying to build. Who do you think is going to be next? I'm just curious. For those who have not seen the slides. That's okay. It's a good call. Actually, I'm going to put customers next. This is the part that is overlooked the most, and it's ironic because it is the absolute most important part of the job. Really. It's the part that, if anyone's read Getting Things Done in Covey, it's quadrant 2, right? It's almost never urgent. It's only urgent when there's a red account or like someone's blowing up and you're going to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue, then it becomes urgent. Otherwise, it's never urgent, it's never in your face, which is why you have to constantly create forcing functions to talk to your customers, right? In the form of research, et cetera. So what's the relationship there? You as the product manager are an advocate for your customer, right? You're trying, and this is why I love your answer. It's about empathy. It's not just understanding, you know, what are your requirements? Like that's the consultant mindset and the reason I try to break away from the consultant mind. You're not saying, what are your requirements? You're saying like, who are you? Why do you do what you do, right? Do you love it? Do you hate it, right? What gets you up in the morning when you get to your work? Like you really have to understand their full context, right? And it's those things when you have those conversations that start to get down like, oh, okay, here are your incentive mechanisms. Here's how you're rewarded that start to give you the return, which is insight, right? And in this relationship, what's critical is you can develop a level of insight that allows you to compete effectively in the market, right? Against who? Against your competitors who are also running at your customers. And your only hope is that your competitors are not as good at developing those relationships and deriving that insight, and then changing that insight into a what, right? Into a what can we build that's actually going to give us competitive leverage and differentiation? You were right. Then are the executives. There are always executives, almost always executives. And so what is your relationship to the executives, whoever those executives may be? I'm going to define it as storyteller, which may not have been the first gut instinct. But at the end of the day, when you're in product, or whether you're an entrepreneur, and that's the next slide, you're telling a story. And you're trying to get people excited by that story and get them invested, right? Get them to buy into what you're saying and kind of demonstrate your credibility. And if you do that successfully, what you get back is funding and support, right? Which is critical for all the rest of the stuff. Now, there's only one more on the right. What do you think it is? So I can take a drink of water. The sales team. You also have all of your constituent functions, right? And again, you're the center of that conversation. What does sales care about? That's what I do for a living. I work for Salesforce. They care about quotas. They care about making their month, right? They care about closing deals, always, right? Marketing, they care about pipeline, right? Pipe gen numbers. They care about leads, cost per lead, support cases, volume, support throughput, et cetera, right? These people are your friends. What's your relationship to them? You have to be an evangelist, and this kind of changes depending on your context. All of this will change depending on your context, right? And I kind of show that on the next slide to an extent. But at a company like Salesforce, most of the sales reps can satisfy their quota in a whole number of ways with a whole number of products. And so we have to evangelize to that sales force that Pardot is actually the thing that they want to invest their time and energy in and try to sell the customer on so that they can make their month, they can make their number. And when you do this and you do it effectively, you get back your results. So this is the framework that we're going to be working on. It is 101. There are tons of things I've done in my career that do not sit nicely in this framework as I've thought through it, right? At YouTube, I did content acquisition. And I had an entire business development team that basically was live streaming events, right? Like when you want to do an event, with Coachella, or the U2 concert or whatever, you need to work that in and get like the streaming rights, et cetera. Where does that fit in? It's kind of go to market. It's kind of part of the product, right? It's kind of, there's technology acquisition, there's corporate development, and M&A. Should you be acquiring someone instead of holistically building something to incorporate that into the offering? Where does that fit? It's kind of on the Eng UX side, right? There's planning and coordination, right? Where does that fit? Mostly on the Eng UX side, but kind of throughout, because everything is tied together. But for a 101, we're going to stick with this and we're going to make it work. So what if you're a startup? This isn't applicable to me. I don't have a sales team of 7,000 people. I don't have a giant marketing team, a giant support team. In some of the most extreme cases, you could collapse this down not just horizontally, you could even collapse down the top layer. It could be you against the market. If you're a one-person company, a one-person entrepreneur, no funding requirement. If that's the case, good for you. That's hard, A. B, you should be cognizant, and probably are cognizant, that you are wearing every single one of these hats, right? And I hope that you think about yourself wearing that product hat kind of in the center, and then you have a conversation with yourself about marketing and have a conversation with yourself about engineering, or you may outsource engineering, but then you've got the actual constituent parties there. And your execs, in most cases, are going to become your venture capitalists if you're going to actually go out and raise money. And if you're going to go out and raise money, ask these guys, you better be able to tell a compelling story, right? And bring it with data. Okay, that is product management in a nutshell. What do PMs do? So we're just going to use that exact same framework and talk about the kind of processes that are overlaid that make up kind of the bulk of a product manager's job. So on the user side, it's about research. It's about conversations, market research, user research. And again, this is probably the most important and most easily overlooked function in product. So as a product leader who leads teams of product managers, you constantly have to create a cadence and a culture and an expectation that there's conversations going on with customers all the time, insights are coming back. When insights come back, you spread those insights. So, today, the meeting that I'm missing to be here, we're going to be presenting some of the research that we just did on a feature called UserSync. And we post it on Chatter, because that's what you do at Salesforce, and we present it in a variety of meetings so we can have conversations to try to have everyone kind of get that, grok that knowledge, and incorporate it into their thinking, right? Because it could change the way that other functions approach it. And folks, and I don't know how we're going to do on time, but if folks want to stick around after, I might do a post game where we actually dig into some of that stuff. Because ideally, you can actually see how some of this stuff works. Salesforce doesn't love me showing. Yeah, anyway, okay. The next thing is your execs, right? You need to know how to write a pitch deck. And this can take a million different functions, right? For most of you in an entrepreneurial context, it's basically going to be a pitch deck for a business plan, right? But it could be a variety of other things. For me, I have 27 bosses. So depending on the boss I'm talking to, I've got kind of a different deck. And trust me, we try to reuse the slides as much as we possibly can. On the engine UX side, basically the entire industry has been taken over by the framework of Agile. Mostly Agile Scrum, in some parts Kanban. I'm going to start with Agile. I'm not going to go super deep into it because there's 1,000,001 courses on Agile. But this is the process that you go through with the engineering teams to try to produce these iterative results, especially in the context of SaaS, when you have such easy access to your market and can constantly be evolving your product. What's the last one? Go to market. This is another area that is often highly overlooked by especially people coming into product originally, and they learn about it the hard way. I have a mentee on my team, and she was just telling me this morning how she learned this the hard way. When you push something out and the sales team's not ready for it, and the marketing team didn't know that it was coming, and the support team didn't know that it was coming, and they come back at you and they let you know. Oh yeah, they're gonna let you know. So that's a bad look. You gotta be very proactive, and you have to develop a go-to-market strategy. It's key, and this was someone's question, as a kind of individual contributor PM, how many of these people report to you? 0. None of them, right? So what do you do, right? The engineers, no one's taking orders. It all becomes about that influence, right? And trust. And that comes on the form of relationships, right? You have to know these people. You have to meet them. You have to really work with them. Even if you're an entrepreneur and you're outsourcing all of this, right? You have to take yourself to the other side of that equation. You're a client, right? It's the way in the entertainment industry, they say you're the talent, right? It's just like, got another client with headaches, right? The closer you can get to those teams, get to know the people who are actually doing the work, right? To form those relationships, the more impactful you're going to be, even though you have no direct organizational implicit authority. And that's, of course, much more art than science. As a PM, you got to do all these things. And so this is the fun part where you start thinking about what happens if you drop the ball, like we just talked about, on any one of these. So what happens if you do a perfect job on pitching, research, and go-to-market, and then completely screw up Agile? You know exactly the right product for exactly the right market fit, and you get back something completely different that doesn't work at all, as of horrible quality, and you fail. What happens if your Agile execution is phenomenal, you got all your funding, and you've got your go-to-market, but you have not talked to your customers? You have the ladder up the wrong wall, and you build completely the wrong product. And you're like, we killed it. We got this great product, and it goes to market, and it's like, what? What market? Anyway, doesn't work. What happens if you do not have your pitch deck, but everything else is working great? Right. You lose your funding. If you don't have funding, you can't pay for any of these. And you may think, oh, that's an entrepreneurial problem. At Salesforce, I am constantly fighting for funding, right? I have to fight for headcount on my own team to hire people. Why do you want to hire him, Josh? And it's extremely hard to get. I have to fight for the initiatives. I have to get the executives to believe in them. So even though with or without headcount, we allocate capacity to it because everything has to be prioritized against everything else, right? Everything consumes resource. And then, of course, if you leave out the go-to-market function, you build the perfect product, you're perfectly financed, you know exactly what it is, and no one ever sees it, right? Usually, it's multiple things going wrong, right? And putting out fires and figuring it out. But the zen of it is trying to find a balance of all these different things. Okay. Going to go into the next half where I literally am just going to start going through each one of these. Any questions? Let's pause so I can take a drink. Really? Okay. It's good enough. All right, let's talk about Agile. These are the Google results for Agile. You can always look at Google results, having worked at Google, and look at how many ads show up to understand some level of demand for SEM keywords, right? There are tons and tons of consultancies out there that want to certify you in Scrum, right? Did I just screw something up? No. What's that? Oh, no. Sorry. Thank you. Technical difficulties. So I'm not one of those. I don't do Scrum certifications. So instead of giving you the entire Agile religion, it is something of a religion, especially in Silicon Valley, let me just give you my perspective on it from a product standpoint. Now, first of all, if you don't know what Agile is, we'll just give you the 100-foot picture. If you're a product manager, your kind of most fundamental unit of responsibility is maintaining a backlog, right? And that backlog, the word that we use is stories, right? You have stories, and those stories get categorized into epics. So, right, you're doing some bigger project, that's an epic. That epic contains stories. A story is an individual unit of work that can be well-defined to an engineer and has an exit criteria. This is what I want in order for this to be done, and it can be measured. And you have conversations with the engineers and explain to them, what the epics are, what the epics and the stories are. And then every 2 weeks or every 1 week, depending on kind of how fast you want to go, you have sprint planning meetings, and you pick the top of the backlog normally, because you should have a prioritized backlog, and you bring them into the sprint. And then every 24 hours, you do stand-up, and you've got a scrum master. And you stand in a circle, and they say, what'd you do yesterday? What'd you complete? What are you doing today? What's blocking you? Right? Just get that communication, and honestly, it should take 5 minutes. I've seen where it takes 50 minutes, then it's not working. And ideally, you get a product increment that comes out of this process. Any questions on kind of the base of Agile? I'm really not going to go into it much more than that. There's a million resources on YouTube on this. Okay. So now I reference Winston Churchill, because this is my actual position on Agile. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Agile is the worst form of software development except for all the others. It's very similar. Software development, if you're not from that side, right, and you haven't done computer science or actually gotten into, Python or JavaScript, et cetera, is extremely hard. And the process of software development, no matter where you are, is going to be messy. The discipline that you bring to it is Agile. And what preceded this, the evil word that you never, ever say you did if you're interviewing, is waterfall. Waterfall. Waterfall is basically what I used to do in consulting. We're going to do a 2-month scope assessment, and we're going to write a 300-page document. And it's going to say exactly what the product is going to do. Then we're going to go into the implementation phase, and we're going to go through that 300-page document, and we're going to build it all out, and then we're going to launch it. Which is if you've never done any of this stuff before, you'd be like, yeah, isn't that the way this works? And honestly, at most companies, yeah, that's still the way it works. And that fails an absurd amount of the time, right? If you actually care about the business results, because things change, right? And products evolve, requirements evolve, and you don't really understand what you're in. And this applies not just for startups. This could be a big IT project for a line of business with big set of users, whatever it is. You don't really understand what they need until you can get it in front of them and see them use it and actually see how they use it and see them say, this doesn't work, right? So the longer you wait to get it in front of them, the higher your probability is it's just going to completely fail. Agile is here to try to alleviate and mitigate as much of that as possible. I can tell you in practice, it's still really hard to run it well. It really is. At the end of the day, what Agile is really about is communication and commitment, right? They call them ceremonies, right? The sprint planning, I didn't talk about the follow-on ceremonies, the retro. Does anyone do retros? You get around on Friday with some beers, you say what went well, what didn't go well, what are we going to change? And then just the stand-ups, right? If nothing else, it's the stand-ups every day that force the team into this kind of communication mode. And it may seem trivial, but what actually happens is you catch the little things that you might not otherwise that would burn you 4 months down the line. And you catch them sooner because they happen to come up in conversation. So much of what goes wrong in software development is a miscommunication between two parties who don't understand their code bases and how those code bases interact. APIs that are not sufficiently defined, dependencies that are not surfaced. And the more conversation and communication you can have, the better the results are going to be. On the commitment side, it's when the whole team is in there for the sprint planning, right? You groom and then you plan. And that team says, I can do this workload, right? They estimate story points, they look at it and they say, within 2 weeks, I'm going to be done with that, right? And it's just that statement, right, that's putting that commitment and consistency on the table so that the engineering team strives to get it done. And in many cases, they don't, right? But then you measure it in burn down chart and you adjust velocity. That's kind of the broader agile framework. So just some best practices, again, from my own personal experience. It's extremely important to focus on these higher level aggregated epics, right? An epic contains multiple stories, right? So an epic could be a whole feature, right? So we've got epics in our backlog now, like integrate public groups into user sync, right? And beneath there's all the tasks that have to happen in order to get that done. By focusing on the epics and defining them, they actually become part of your broader story, right? And when you go into planning, you asked about planning, you plan for the epics. You don't plan with stories, right? The epics are your bets. That's where you're putting your money. You're saying, this is the thing that's going to drive the needle, right? And the needle measures your KPIs, and we'll get to that as well. Those are the things that bolster your story, right? So again, it all kind of ties around. And at the end of the day, the epics are most likely the thing that you're going to be coming up with positioning and go-to-market statements and demo when you go to market, right? And train your sales team, et cetera. Yes, yeah, of course, thank you.
Do you think of it as an insight from the customer down here that drives an epic?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, they're all connected. It's the conversations you've been having with customers that ultimately drive the prioritization decisions that end up becoming an epic. The thing that is not easy to explain without having been in the job is this is not linear, right? You can't come up with like, well, first you talk to the customer, and then you talk to the executive, and then you do the agile thing, and then you go to market. It's even more, so is it a virtuous cycle? It is a virtuous cycle. The more you're communicating around, the better. The truth is, it ends up becoming a series of conversations that live in the organization, and they can live for years, right? And they're kind of these like latent hypotheses. And as a product manager, one of your jobs when you start to learn how to lead is you say, that's the one. And you take that conversation and you hold it up and you're like, this is incredibly important, right? And usually those conversations will live in ambiguity. And you'll have all these different constituent parties and they'll all have a different idea of what does this mean? Like, what are you talking about? Right, the biggest thing, we just announced this at Dreamforce that I'm working on right now is called multiple business units, Pardot business units. That conversation lived in Pardot. David, did they ever talk about business units when you owned the company and ran it? Okay, you're talking. we multiple different marketing units that want to partition prospects. So we're launching that in my program. Soon, next summer. Soon at Salesforce, next summer is soon, just so you know. I'm not kidding about that. But fundamentally, it's those flows of conversation that eventually you do more research, right? You bring it, you develop, you really clarify your hypothesis. Then you come up with your pitch deck, right? You don't just pitch it to you pitch it to the execs, you get their buy-in, you pitch it everywhere else. You pitch it to engineering management, you pitch it to the IC, you get up in an all hands, like whatever it is in whatever environment you're in, you get that level of buy-in. And then ultimately, when it shows up on a slide that says we're committing within this given time frame for planning, like quarterly or release-wise or whatever you plan it, the epic shows up. And at that point, when it shows up, through this storytelling to the organization, you all have a similar idea of what it means, why you're doing it, and what the anticipated impact is going to be of it. Yeah, okay, more questions.
So do the epics go into the roadmap? Like, do you
Yes.
you write the epics in the roadmap?
They're basically one and the same, right? The roadmap is just the forcing function to kind of put a leave behind into your story, right? The story should be something that anyone can follow. A roadmap is an artifact that basically says time is on the x-axis, and then the y-axis can be themes or something else, and you're basically filling in a grid with information about what you're going to do when, right? But every one of those is kind of a constituent component of your broader story and the impact you want to have. But yeah, generally, the epics level is going to be the thing that shows in your roadmap, the thing you're telling in your story, and then it's the thing that actually goes into Jira or your planning tool that gets broken down into stories.
Now, isn't a theme a little bit higher level than the epics, though?
So I just tried, we did themes at AdRoll, so you can have broader themes of the business, and it worked phenomenally well, and everyone did it. And I'm like, I'm an expert, I'm going to bring it to Salesforce. And I did themes, and everyone just makes fun of them, and they fell flat on their face. And I'm like, oh, I did it like a flower with theme thing in the middle, and now everyone's like, oh, it's that stupid flower again. I'm just like, every context is going to be different. You have to be able to adapt, right? Some things are going to stick, some things are not. Themes can be great in a larger context when you want to try to tie together what a bunch of different Scrum teams are doing, right? Like, we are going to win the enterprise. We're going to enable extraordinary personalization. And it creates a framework for you to say, I'm doing this because it totally ties into winning the enterprise, right? But is it essential? I didn't even put it in the deck after this past experience with it, honestly. Yeah.
How do you think about how much time you should encourage engineers to also be in front of customers?
Yeah.
And hear the why and the problems they're solving versus just, here, go do this.
Yeah. How much time should engineers be in front of customers? As much as they're willing. When you actually break it down, and I've worked with tons of Scrum teams now, you're going to have, they're people. They're going to have different personalities. They're going to have different desires. And they tend to fit in kind of like stereotypical categories. You're going to have engineers who are just like, man, I just tell me what to code and leave me alone. And the truth is, you got to respect that. That's what they want, right? And they might not even want that much context. They're just like, I want to have a relationship with the code. Okay, that's cool. That's your thing. On the exact opposite side, you'll have the people who have impacted my career more than anyone else are like the architect level, the exceptional engineers, right? Like, and one exceptional engineer is worth more in gold, than 100 non-exceptional engineers. And those people, oh my God, you've got to bring them into everything, get them in the conversations, thinking about architecture, because they have such an impact over the entire engineering team, and they're few and far between it. Every company I've worked at, there have been like 3, maybe, or 4, right? Out of hundreds. We've got 160 engineers on Pardot. And then most other people are in the middle. And like, some of them are going to be really interested, some of them are not. I just took Nick Hunt, who's an engineer who's not even on my program, to Dreamforce, and he stood on stage in front of 500 people with me and clicked through a 20-minute demo that a customer led, right? And so he worked with the customer without me, just one-on-one for a month to nail that demo. And at first I was like, Nick, I'm so sorry. Like, this blew up into this unbelievable commitment. And he said it was awesome. He loved it, right? Because it just gave him a much broader perspective on what we do, right? And he got to really talk to an awesome customer. Okay, where am I? Know every ticket. If you're the product manager, and this is harder than it sounds, a lot of times you're writing the tickets. In reality, sometimes you're not. Do you write every single ticket? No, right? Sometimes your tech lead will write it, or your scrum master will write it, or an engineer will write it, and they'll write something completely incomprehensible, right? It's your job to know every single ticket in your backlog, what it means, what the impact is, and make a decision and have a position on it, because you need the next bullet to prioritize that backlog religiously. It's the act of prioritizing the backlog that is a function to have you ask yourself, what is most important right now? And again, this is one of these things that might seem really easy theoretically. When you try to do it in practice, it's unbelievably hard. You constantly have to do that. And then when you know the ticket, that's not enough. You have to have the conversation with your engineers who are picking that up so they know the ticket and they understand it, or else you're not going to get the results you want back from it. And they understand why. Why are you asking them to do this? This is just as important with outsourced teams as it is with your own dedicated team, maybe even more so. I'm telling you, I did an event at ATV and I told folks, as an entrepreneur, if you're outsourcing, you should like keep a camera to your team 24 hours a day and be taught. And they're like, you're kidding. You clearly don't understand our lives. And I'm like, that's fine. I get that that's an exaggeration, but you got to get what's happening on the other side of that equation, right? They're like, what? What is that? What do they want? Whatever. Just get it done. And then they just get it done and it'll be the wrong thing, right? You have to have those conversations with the people who are writing the code. Planning. Planning is essential. So you don't realize planning is essential until there is no planning. And then suddenly, and I've walked into many environments, even at a company like Hulu, right, that started with $100 million in the bank, right, from these big. Now, I walked in there to the team that ran the whole video pipeline. There's no planning. What did the engineers do? I mean, there was no agile. There was nothing, right? They just, the boss said, pick this up, pick that up, right? That's how Pardot was founded, right? Like Blitzer would walk around or David would write something and, right, it just kind of is all over the map. And at some point, at some scale, you have to put in that process and then say, okay, we're going to create these arbitrary designations. And most of the time, it's been on a quarterly basis where we say, this is what we're going to accomplish in the next quarter. And you write it down, right? And then you review it. And that document becomes part of the story, part of the broader narrative, right? But just the act of going through it and talking about it with the team is critical to getting everybody aligned and on board. Most of the organizations I've been at, we've done OKRs, Objectives and Key Results, which is a framework out of Kleiner Perkins that Google implements and others. I've brought it to Hulu and other places. It works phenomenally well. At Salesforce, we do release planning 3 times a year. And it's on the cadence of the actual major releases. But you have to figure out what works for you. And I've said it before, I'll say it one more time because it's on the slide and it's critically important. Invest in the relationships with your engineering team. Know them as people, even if they're contractors, right? Ask them about their kids. Know what they do for fun, right? It's gonna help when you have these real conversations and conflict will arise. Right, where they're like, there's no way this can be done, and you're like, no, I'm pretty sure this can be done. And when that happens, you have to have the relationship to back it up so you can find a compromise that makes you both happy. Okay, any other questions on Agile? Because this is honestly, most of the time when you talk about product management, it's just like, oh, it's Agile. It's like, yeah, that's one little component of it that takes up a lot of time, but there's much more to it. Any other questions on Agile?
I didn't understand the term ticket. I've worked in Agile before.
I'm sorry.
I've heard that word. Is it semantic? What is that?
Yeah, the question is, what does the word ticket mean? And so this is the problem with having been doing this for 20 years, is like, I don't even know the terms that I'm saying because they're innate. So ticket is any given system that you use to track the work that's being done. It's the same thing as saying a user story. At the end of the day, it's a record in a database somewhere that says this is the thing and what's the status of it, and it shows up in the context of a backlog. It's not like a support ticket. That's a different kind of ticket.
I want to make sure that it wasn't.
No, those are important too. And sometimes your ticket is to address a support ticket, just to your story. And then there's debate. Well, it's a story. It's not a bug. And it's like, whatever. If it consumes capacity, it consumes capacity. Any other Agile questions? How are we doing on time, JC? I don't know. Okay. We got until 3. Okay. We're going to keep going. At Atlanta Tech Village, when I sit down tomorrow at 10 a.m. and somebody comes up and says, hi, can I talk to you about my business? I say, sure. What is the biggest mistake that they make? I can make a guess before they even sit down and start talking to me.
In their business or
What's the biggest mistake they're making right now?
not thinking that they have product market fit, but they don't.
Okay, yeah, that's close. Anyone else? Not having data. I was gonna say, they have no idea who their customer is, right? They have an idea, they have a concept, and they do what they're good at, right? And what they're good at, the vast majority of them is they've taken the online courses or they've done formal education, and they know how to build a website that's backed by a relational database, which is the vast majority of companies out there, right? And so what do? They build a web app backed by a relational database. And they're like, okay, now what? I'm like, who's your customer? How are you going to go to market? How are you going to acquire customers, et cetera? This book, how many people have read this book? Okay, well, I don't even have to tell you that. It's short. It's fairly cheap. It's on Amazon. I've read a lot of books about product. This is the one that, for whatever reason, just really hit me and stuck with me. And I feel like has a lot of momentum in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And fundamentally, what Eric Ries has done that's kind of brilliant is he took a lot of the thinking and process from lean manufacturing, and he tries to bring it into the world of technology. And his, I'm going to paraphrase him, but his basic premise is that if you're a startup, you don't know where you need to go. You can't, right? It's only a big company that has results behind them that can look at those results and extrapolate and say, I think it's going to be here, and we know fairly well, blah, 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 right? Salesforce, for example, is absolutely in that position, right? You've got, especially the core, the more the core of the product, the more predictable everything becomes in terms of planning, everything. When you're a startup, you have to come up with an idea and then build the absolute smallest thing you possibly can to effectively test that idea, right? Measure its impact by actually bringing it in front of customers, and then learn and make a decision whether you persevere or whether you pivot onto something else, right? And he uses a specific term for this. He uses a bunch of terms, but the first one is a hypothesis, right? And you've heard this before, right? A hypothesis can be at any level, right? You can be like an entrepreneur and you'd be like, I have a hypothesis. I was just talking to someone that like there needs to be a website where I can like get dog information and it's going to be like awesome and it's going to give me all this information. Or I have a hypothesis. It can be at a new customer level, a feature level. It can be the smallest little thing. Like I have a hypothesis that customers need a checkbox in this list of settings to help them do this, right? You can come up with it at any point, and then you have to test it. And so someone brought up MVP. What does MVP stand for? Yeah, not most valuable player. It stands for minimum viable product, right? This is worth taking a minute on talking about because this is, honestly, it's not that intuitive. When Eric Ries defines it, he doesn't define it as the minimum viable product that you're going to bring to market, monetize, and be successful with, right? He defines it as the minimum viable iteration to test your hypothesis. And so literally, your minimum viable product could be a sketch on a napkin, right? If that sketch on a napkin, when you bring it in front of your customer, gives you the information that you need to know whether you pivot or persevere, right? And then you generate a new hypothesis and you move forward. So I think it's almost a misnomer, right? It's almost like minimum viable learning increment or testing or something like that, right? Because I think this gets conflated with people saying, well, what is the product that you're going to go to market with, right? Because that's not really what I think what he was getting at. So back to my first point of the customer, I'll work with folks, at ATV who have, big ideas, which is great. But a lot of times what they do is they'll build the whole thing. So I talked to a guy 2 months ago who's like, I bet that we could build a business to outsource the SDR BDR function, outsource inside sales. And it's like, okay, cool. That in and of itself is a hypothesis, right? And so what did he do? He built an entire application, right? And the application was create a campaign, right? Upload your script, right? Review a list of people and their qualifications, send approvals back, for the people who have applied to be your marketers, find results of their conversations, et cetera. And the application was completely built, fully hooked up. It was a fully live application. And of course, the first thing I said is, who's your customer? Right? Who's going to buy this thing? And they're like, salespeople. I'm like, salespeople is a big category. Like, let's narrow it down. Like, think about segment, think about vertical, think about is inside sales function, outside sales function. A is like, who are you taking this to? And have you shown them anything? And generally the answer is no, right? Because that's honestly, it's the part that's less comfortable. It's the part that's harder. It's the part that forces you to be an extrovert and go out into the world and have these conversations and kind of expose your idea, to the market, which is terrifying because most of the time the market's going to be like, bam, right? Your idea is terrible. And you have to be willing to take that. What do you think would be a minimum viable product for that idea, that business plan of outsourcing an inside sales function? Yeah.
Pick one department, source and recipient, that's repetitive, so that you don't get caught in the variation. And try to sit at the shoulder of both sides of that conversation, one at a time.
Yeah, so you're saying put yourself in the actual situation, right? So what's the product?
From both perspectives at once.
Yeah, but what's the product? What's the minimum viable product? The MVP? Email, a spreadsheet, a phone call, right? If you need a script, if you need to know people, like every single thing that he built was just a hypothesis that was not validated by the market, right? If you want to validate that idea, call someone you think is going to be your customer and be like, hey, do you want to outsource your inside sales? Right? Great. Send me your script. Right? Here are the metrics I propose. What do you think of those? Right? And literally just have a conversation, follow up over email and Word docs or Google Docs. Like the minimum viable product can be no product, right? Which is super counterintuitive, but at the same time, if they had started there and had those conversations and informed themselves by the market, they may have come up with a completely different product to build, right? That would actually give them the insight they need to be successful and find that product market fit, right? This is a slide from Spotify that I love, so I'll always grant Spotify. The concept behind a lot of this user validation and pivoting strategy is that you want to create increments of value over time that lead to the yay, big value at the end, right? So what you do not want to do is have, here's a wheel. Like, does this solve your problem? No. Here's two wheels connected. Does that solve your problem? You get it. Like eventually there's a car that solves your problem, but along the way there was no validation because there was no value created in the incremental steps, right? Along the bottom, you got your skateboard and your scooter and your bicycle, right? And over time, you're kind of pivoting towards something that is much more full-featured, that solves the full and complete problem, but you're learning along the way and ideally delivering increments of value to the customer. Yeah.
So I love this, I love that too.
Yeah, it's great.
It's my favorite thing. But one thing that I struggle with, and certain problems are easier than
Yeah.
others to do it, but one thing that I struggle with is how do you kind of force yourself and your team to have the brainstorming session that gets you to this? So we're trying to get a car, and we think our customers would love a car, and so we don't do the top. We're going to do the bottom, but the only way that you can do the bottom, the 5 steps on the bottom, is if your aha moment, if your insight is what we're going to provide for them is forward motion.
Yeah.
What they really want is forward motion, and so at
Yeah.
various stages, I'm going to give them a way to move forward.
Yeah.
And then at 5, I'm going to give them.
Right. So how do you come up with this is the
How do
question.
you come up with that aha moment?
You've got the vision. The vision is the car, is 5. You don't know 2, 3, 4, or 1, right? And how do you brainstorm with your team? You brainstorm with your team, which is actually enormously fun. But even better than that, why don't you brainstorm with a bunch of customers?
But how do you brainstorm about, so the real answer that you need to get to this is to say, what we really need to do in order to go on the bottoms of the top is deliver forward motion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your idea and the thing that you believe in and your epic that you're going to place bets on is, I'm going to give you a car.
Yep.
But in order to do this, well, you have to say, actually, what I really need to give you is forward motion.
So that's great. So it's are you trying to deliver a car? Or are you trying to deliver forward motion? So my answer to that is actually straight from the Lean Startup, where he has a chapter on the 5 whys, right? And so if you force yourself to ask why 5 times, like my 3-year-old does every day on the way to school, then you are going to get to, well, why do you want a car? Well, I need to get from point A to point B. well, how might I get from point A to point B? And you can actually, there's a whole other set of exercises we're not gonna have time for today, where you map this on the board and you say, why do you want to do this? What's stopping you from doing it? And you frame it as a challenge. And you can say, well, I started here, but the place I really want to attack is here. And then the other thing you said that I'm not sure I agree with would be, you say, well, the car is the epic. I'd say, no, the car's not the epic. The car's the vision. The vision's not the epic. The epic is the increment, right? The kind of largest scale increment. And so the epic might be the skateboard at the most, right? Because you don't even know where it's necessarily going. But by delivering that skateboard, you give it to a customer, they're like, this is cool, but I keep falling down, smashing my head, and I can't go very fast, and I suck at it. Do you have something easier? Right? And you're like, I don't know. And then it's a discovery process of getting from 1 to 2, right? That's iterated and validated by the market as you go. Sure.
So would you consider the bottom portion like a minimum marketable product?
Wow, we've only got a half an hour. I have learned that this presentation is too long. We may have to skip the exercises, unfortunately. What is a minimum viable product in this framework? Is that the question?
Minimum marketable product.
Oh, marketable.
You can start selling the skateboard. And then when you get feedback on the skateboard, you can add the other feature, then you can evolve it to the
Yeah. So it's interesting. We don't usually talk about minimum marketable product, but it's a good distinction between kind of the iteration discovery framework and the go-to-market side. On the go-to-market side, you do have to ask yourself the question, and this is also within product management's purview, what is the minimum marketable product that I can actually go to market with? And so, yeah, I mean, if you want to vet that, you talk to your customer, you talk to your sales team, right? You talk to these constituent folks and you say, could you go out and sell this? And then what would be the right price point for it? There's not as much value as the vision in step 5. Maybe you extract a smaller price for it. And then obviously this is a metaphor. You don't actually go from a skateboard to a car. On the software side, and many times you can, right? Because if you build the correct foundation, which is much easier said than done, you can continue to iterate to something that's much more full-featured and valuable over time. I'm going to keep going just because I realize I'm way behind on time. So let's just talk about some user experience research best practice, right? This whole domain of user experience research. Write down your hypothesis. Don't make it like a latent thing. Force yourself to write it down and treat the words carefully, like really, work on them, hone them, because the definition of that hypothesis is going to drive a lot about what you do downstream. Think about your goals in doing the research and talking to customers, and what are the key decisions that you hope to influence coming out of the research. Then you have to know, who am I going to talk to? What's the target audience and what's the scope of the conversation? And then, only then, do you say, how do I go about this? There are hundreds of research methodologies that people learn by getting PhDs in this stuff and that you can study endlessly. The one that works enormously well is having a conversation and just saying, asking open-ended questions, right? Don't ask yes or no questions. Why? What? Right? Listen, follow up, etc. And then show people concepts and have them react to them. So that forms your interview guide. And you always start with unaided and you get to aided. Does anyone know what I mean by that? I'm starting to use the lingo, sorry. Unaided would be, you just ask a big, open, broad question, right? It's like, can you think of any soda brands? All right, that would be like a brand awareness unaided question, right? Like, what soda brands can you think of? And then an aided question would be like, have you heard of Pepsi, right? Most people would say, yes, you've heard of Pepsi. But when you actually are structuring these interview guides, you always try to start as open as possible and then narrow down until you're asking very specific pointed questions. And the reason for that is you do not want to lead, right? You want to listen, you want to let them offer their perspective as opposed to dragging them along. And that's the art. And that's the thing that's challenging. This can go terribly wrong if you go in and say, my hypothesis is right, so I'm going to have you tell me why it's right. And then they say something, you're like, no, it's supposed to work like this, right? The second you do that, it's wasted, right? And you're just kidding yourself and fooling yourself. You don't have the product market fit that you're looking for. Yeah.
Sometimes on customer calls, I've struggled with letting them, ask these opening questions, keep asking why into it, but of a sudden an hour has passed by, or maybe an hour and a half or something, and
Yeah.
you know, you let them lead too much.
Yeah.
What's the balance in kind of steering the conversation?
Yeah, if we can do the post game, I can show you some of our approaches, but you basically define the boundaries. You say for 20 minutes, we're going to talk and ask some questions, and for 40 minutes, I'm going to show you some mocks, right? And this is why if you're in a luxurious situation like I am and you have a user experience researcher, they do a phenomenal job. They do this for a living. The reality is the research I just did with me and a designer, and we just came up with it ourselves. We recruited the participants, everything, you know? They hate it when I say this, but it's not rocket science to do it. And it's not even rocket science to do it well. The reason I say that is not to say that the domain of UXR is not a lofty domain. It is. It's because if you don't believe you can do it, you won't do it. And the most important thing is you have to do it. You absolutely have to do this. Nothing can be successful, in my opinion, without doing this, unless you're just unbelievably lucky, right? So the study that we just did was, in my opinion, extraordinarily successful. Why was it extraordinarily successful? Because we proved we were completely wrong. Dead wrong. And this is on something that that I had a professional designer work on for maybe 3 weeks. And we iterated on it. We went through it 100 times. We talked about it to death. We came up with it. We said the fourth version, we're like, step 1, step 2, step 3. We're like, we nailed it. We brought it to the market. Totally wrong. Didn't get it. No one got it. Great. Throw it away. Start again. Do it again. Yeah. All right. We definitely don't have time to do this. I'm going to keep going. So I would encourage you to think about who is your target customer? What is your current hypothesis at the business level, feature, whatever it is, product level? What is that minimum thing you're going to test and how? And just write a little interview guide, you know, call some customers, anyone, put it on Craigslist, however you get in touch with your target market and try it. You really got to try it to understand it. Okay, I'm going to zip through this one because the next one I think is more interesting and important. Because again, there's a lot of stuff on the internet about how to write a pitch deck. Fundamentally, this is about inspiring confidence. It's about inspiring confidence in you, especially if you're an entrepreneur, in your ideas, in the fact that they're well thought through, right? So you can find tons of stuff on business planning. I'm not going to give you a business planning lecture. It's about storytelling, and storytelling is an absolute art, right? I've got a long list here of both topics that tend to go into a story, as well as the stuff that's not as obvious about the process of storytelling. So the first is just the topics, right? In any decent business plan, you're probably going to talk about the market that you're going after. You're probably going to come up with some estimate of the size of that market, right? Especially in a venture capital context, right? VCs, they raise funds. They're going to make a bunch of bets. They need a certain return at a multiple in order to just be able to return the kind of ROI back to their investors, right? So they need big markets. They need at least one thing to hit in order to get those results over time. And then what is the growth rate of that market? Who is the competition, right? If you have no competition in a market, that's not necessarily a good thing. That might put the market into question. Well, why isn't anybody in it, right? It kind of goes against efficient markets. What research have you done? Who have you talked to? What are the insights you have into your customer? And what differentiation can you bring to the table, right? Why are you better than the next person who's going to walk into here to solve that problem, all right? And that's, honestly, it's a hard question to answer. Pricing and packaging I'll get to in a second. What are your KPIs? How are you going to know whether you're successful, right? It's really easy to be like, we're going to make a ton of money, but like that might not actually be the right initial KPI. That might not be talking about traction, right? We talk about incremental customer acquisition, incremental revenue as the principal KPI at Salesforce, right? And then the revenue that ultimately drives on kind of an annuity basis via these kind of longer term contracts, right? As well as even just pipeline growth. And from a product standpoint, we just launched the Lightning app. I'm looking at 30-day active users, right? In the last 30 days, how many unique users have come and used the site? How long do they stay on it? Right? Things like that. And like identifying those metrics and knowing that you've kind of got the ladder up against the right wall is critical. If you have the wrong metrics, you're going to have the wrong result. What is the product in the roadmap? That's what we talked about. What are your financial models and your assumptions? What's your customer acquisition cost? What do you think will be the lifetime value of these customers, right? Over time, how do you need to scale, and what are the parameters that are going to determine whether you can actually make this profitable? And then, of course, what are the risks to the business and how are you going to mitigate them? Almost more interesting is when you go into this process, how do you approach it? And this, again, is going to depend enormously on the context, right? But if you're going to have a conversation and pitch an executive, who is that executive? What is your goal in talking to them? What is their goal? How are they compensated? What matters to them? And how do you make your story align to theirs, right? Like what's a key thing to talk about if you're an entrepreneur and you're going in to talk to venture capitalists with respect to alignment? Aligning your goals to theirs. Profit. I think there's something more specific. If you're exit, right? Exit. If you don't know your exit strategy, which is probably IPO or acquisition, and most likely acquisition, you're probably not going to be aligned with the VC because that's how the vast majority of their profits are going to be made. And to that end, if you're going to have a compelling pitch, maybe you should talk about what are the industries currently that might value a product like this from an acquisition standpoint, right? Let the slides and data tell the story, right? Be generous with the slide headers. They should just be able to read the slide headers and know exactly what you're talking about. And then the data backs those up. Anticipate the questions they have by pre-pitching the deck to as many people as possible. Your business plan is not some extraordinary, beautiful secret, right? Get it out into the world to smart people, any smart people. It doesn't have to be other VCs or other executives, just smart people, and pitch it to them. They will come up with questions you don't anticipate. You take those questions, you turn them around, and you incorporate them into your story. It makes your story stronger. Know what you're asking for. In the context of entrepreneurship, they say, how much money do you need? You're like, no, I don't know, like 500,000, maybe $1 million. That's, of course, the wrong answer, right? You say, I need $750,000 at this valuation, et cetera, and then you go into a negotiation on that, if you're lucky. Build coalitions ahead of time. This is more in the kind of like context I'm in like a broad corporate context. And I did this. This is the thing I learned the hard way at Google as kind of an ICPM. When you're called in to present to Larry and Sergey, which you were back in 2006 and 2007, the first thing you do is know who's in the room, who else, show them the presentation, get them bought in so that they either A, are defending you when you're attacked, right, over some aspect, right, because they believe in it ahead of time, or B, they don't care and they just are on their laptop and they don't pay attention, you walk out unscathed, right? It depends on what you need, right? And that's about testing the deck and iterating on it. Like 20 minutes. Any questions on the pitch deck, best practices, et cetera? Again, like you could do an entire course on any one of these things, right? So this is 101. All right, what's this from? Some other old people in the room with me. All right, there you go. If you build it, they will come. This is Field of Dreams. In software, this is a lie. If you build it, they do not come. The vast majority of the time, except if you're at Google. Google was, the complete outlier where they built it, and then everyone came because their search quality was so much better than everyone else at the time. The entire company is founded on this premise that, you'll just build it and it'll come, and then marketing becomes this very secondary thing. If you're in enterprise software, marketing, almost any other segment, you build it, they ain't coming. You got to be able to go to market. You have to be able to go to market strongly with partners who are really good at their job and are very aligned with you. So I went to Kellogg. Kellogg is known for marketing. And I majored in marketing, which means almost nothing, I guarantee you, with respect to business schools. The thing that they teach you are the 4 Ps, which are product, price, promotion, and place. Okay, what is this good for selling? Cereal, right? It's not a coincidence. It's called Kellogg's. It's funded by the Kellogg's. And it's fundamentally about old school consumer packaged goods marketing. I don't want to make fun of it. One of my best friends is in LA, was the VP of marketing at Beyond Meat. He's been in CPG for 13 years. I've got lots of friends who went to Clorox and other places. And consumer packaged goods is a challenging, interesting industry. It's not what most of us are probably doing from an entrepreneurial side. We're probably doing more technology, right? It has a lot of intrinsic stuff. So if this is the old marketing mix, what's a new marketing mix? I would suggest 4 different Ps that are highly relevant to my everyday. Pricing, packaging, positioning, and pitching. What is pricing and packaging?
Assess your plans,
I'm sorry?
your plans, your product plans.
As a product plans. What else? Different modules you can buy, right? Yeah, so that's just how it gets to your customers, like distribution channels. Fundamentally, pricing and packaging is, especially in the SaaS space, this is huge. Have you seen a page that looks like this? Yeah, duh. Everyone has. This happens to be Pardot's page. We just went through a repackaging exercise and a repricing exercise 6 or 7 months ago. And so that's actually the first time I think I've ever done that. And so we got to actually see how that process all worked. This pricing and packaging is critically important for go-to-market. If you get this wrong, you're completely off. And even if your product has fit, it's not going to have fit from a pricing and packaging standpoint, right? Pricing is what are you going to ask the customer to pay, and what value are they getting in response to it? Do they see that trade-off as being equal? Are they willing to pay that price? And then what discounts is the sales team going to offer depending on the space that you're in? Packaging is how are you going to offer different additions to different segments of the market that make sense to those segments so you can speak to those segments, right? And then when you actually go to market, how your customers decide to buy this is then the pricing and packaging mix or the addition mix. Depending on the mix, you're going to have drastically different results, right? And in your financial modeling, you have to account for that by saying, how many people do I think are going to buy the middle tier, right? And everyone says most popular, right? Why do they say most popular right there? Probably because it actually is probably the most popular, but it's because the model says to drive people to there and then try to upsell the big customer to the top one. You don't necessarily want people going to the bottom one because you're going to be sacrificing too much revenue. This is a huge part of product management that is completely overlooked for the most part. And where the rubber hits the road are the details. Yeah.
So how should a startup think about pricing their first product launch?
How should a startup think about pricing their first product launch? It's a very, very good question. When we tested the new pricing and packaging, you might not believe the way you do it. You go to your customers and you say, what would you be willing to pay for this? And in most cases, they'll answer you and they'll tell you how much value they see in it. And that's an unaided question. The aided question would be, would you be willing to pay $400 a month for this? Right? No, like depending on the response you get. And you survey, right? Like once you've done that qualitative, you can do quantitative if you have access to a large enough sample size to make the quantitative work. And you can get a sense of like, what is the willingness to pay? You may always be better off starting at a slightly higher price point because it's easier to bring it down than it is to push it up, right? So those are some of the things to think about. But the big role of product in this equation tends to be, and any entrepreneur, what goes into each edition when you break them out, right? And this is these giant matrices you see with the dots. They're filled in or not filled in or optional or add-on or whatever it is, right? This is really kind of putting on all the hats and thinking from a sales perspective, from a marketing perspective, can I talk about this? Can I explain the differences? And then based on what the differences are, is there sufficient value encapsulated in those to push someone to the next tier? And we're constantly talking about this in Salesforce. Where should we put Pardot business units? We're putting Pardot business units in advanced. Why? Because the segment that we're targeting for advanced is the highest level enterprise segment. Business units is a fundamentally enterprise problem, right? They've got different divisions across the globe. They do acquisitions and they have multiple brands, et cetera. And we want to try to change the mix to push more of those enterprise customers up into the top level edition. Critical stuff, again, not usually thought of in the case of product management. I'm, again, lucky that I have a brilliant guy who works in pricing strategy who helps with this kind of stuff. But ultimately, it's the entrepreneur's responsibility to come up with this stuff and test it against the market. Think about it just like any other MVP, right? You've got a hypothesis for how you can do this. Go to the market and validate it. Sorry, David.
Why does the Pardot name still exist? The others went away.
That is the hell of my life. Because I have 7 bosses between me and Benioff. And certain ones want to keep the name and other ones want to rebrand and they haven't decided yet. So inertia, that's the answer. I don't know which way that's going to go. We've changed it internally like 4 times. Sorry.
Just wondering, so if you're going out with your MVP, just trying to get your thoughts on this, you're going out with your MVP, does it make sense in some ways to say this costs $100, and then as you add and as you grow, then you start to tier out and you say, okay, now I have advanced, I've got the super advanced and the gold, platinum, whatever.
Yep.
Does that make
Yeah. Can you start simple with like one product and then expand it out into multiple products? Absolutely. Right. It's the same thing as the skateboard, right? Is there value in that first thing, right? I mean, if you can't prove value in one single product and you haven't demonstrated that fit, why would you do 3? You're just going to confuse everybody. And then you have 3 products that have no value that are skewed out.
I think there's a lot of kind of forward momentum kind of into this 3 tiers, and I have to have the small, medium, and large, and the one in the
Yeah.
middle is the most popular. I think people think they're doing something wrong.
Yeah, people think they're doing something wrong if they don't do 3 tiers. It's groupthink.
It is.
And I mean, you can debate, is it groupthink or is it best practice? Seems to be best practice, probably groupthink, and like, look at your business. What makes sense for your business? You don't have to follow that trend. I think to some extent, it probably is also best practice because when you actually go to pitch stuff, option 1, option 2, option 3 starts to feel very natural. If you say option 7, option 9, option 27, look at Marketo's pricing and packaging. I don't know if anyone, they just got acquired by Adobe. They're our biggest competitor. It's all over the map. They've got 6 different things. It's incredibly confusing. And I think, it's one of the reasons we stuck with 3 different editions because it makes for a simpler conversation and simpler trade-offs for the customer to decide between.
But to the extent that you actually do have 3 options that are different and provide different sets of values to a potential customer, like, small is good for me or medium is
Yeah.
good for me. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to who are you targeting and how do you segment that market, right? And if you are, so many businesses, honestly, they start kind of in the middle, right? And this is the same story with AdRoll, same story with Pardot in my experience. They start in the middle and then they try to branch out, sometimes at the same time, which is really frustrating is kind of the exact opposite of strategy. Strategy is you pick one thing at the expense of another thing. So you put more of your investment there, less of your investment there. If you're going to start in the middle, you're going to have little mom and pop shops that might be interested. You probably want to cater to them. You might, maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to go up market. At AdRoll, we had a competitor. Our biggest competitor was Criteo, right? It's the French retargeting company. 100% up market, 100% white glove, right? Their average deal size was like 5 times what ours was, right? It's just which part of the market are you targeting? And if you want to go up, you better have the value to show for it, right? What is positioning? What time is it? 10 minutes, okay.
You mean like I am the white glove concierge?
You're the white. Sorry, someone in the back.
Getting into the right hands or putting it in front of the right people and getting into the right hands.
Putting it in front of the right people and into the right hands. And sorry.
I was just saying
Yeah.
positioning, like you were saying them, they are the white glove. I'm the white glove. I'm
Yeah.
the mom and pop. I'm the
Right.
sure you have your
Yeah, so I would call that segmentation. This is one of these words I remember hearing it a long time ago when I worked at VMware. I'm like, they're like, wow, it's so cool. And then you're like, nah, it's not actually that interesting. Anyone else? Positioning is basically saying, what is this thing and what mental space should it entail? It's a marketing term, fundamentally. What is the positioning of BMW? Luxury. It's actually, there's a specific word. What is it? Yeah. It's performance, right? The ultimate driving machine, right? Why did they choose that tagline? Was it a mistake? No. They say, this is our positioning, right? Our positioning is performance. What's the positioning of Volvo? safety. Volvo for life, right? If you want to protect life, go with Volvo, right? Does this necessarily mean that Volvos are safer than BMWs? Does it necessarily mean BMWs are that much more performant than Volvos? Especially when you get into software, software has a commoditization curve, right? Like very quickly, things start to commoditize, right? And when it commoditizes, you have less differentiation. Marketing is the key where you start to try to create differentiation as a perception, even if it's not the reality, right? And this is where you have to start working with your marketers, have a position. It's not necessarily your job to come up with all this stuff. But in product, when you're having the conversation with marketing about what is their go-to-market plan, how are they going to generate demand, you better understand what's the positioning of this product in market, test that positioning, do the same MVP testing with it, right? Marketing teams do that, right? And then how does that translate into messaging, right? And messaging matters. What are you going to type into the text field in the Facebook ad that you're going to have to run to prove your customer acquisition strategy? What are you going to type into the SEM ad on Google and AdWords, right? Then what are you going to bid, right? That message should be derived from the positioning that you're doing. So I had this great positioning exercise and we're going to run out of time. But I could probably, we'll have this deck out later so you could try this in your own time. Mad Libs. Who remembers Mad Libs? Okay, a few of us. Again, there you go. 90s. For target customer that wants an underlying need. Product name is a category that enables value proposition. Unlike competitors, we deliver killer differentiation, right? It's kind of fun. It's kind of silly. It kind of matters. It should be kind of in your pitch deck because this is your positioning, right? So what does Pardot look like? For B2B marketers that want to generate leads and drive ROI, Pardot is a marketing automation platform that enables lead acquisition, nurturing, and scoring to align sales and marketing. Unlike Marketo, we deliver a single integrated marketing automation and CRM solution. People are digesting. So why do you do this? Again, it's kind of that consensus building around how are you going to talk about it so that you can then go to market through all those marketing and other channels. As the product manager, you got to be looped in on these conversations. You should have a position in the conversation. Sometimes you're not leading it. If you're the entrepreneur, you're absolutely leading it. Like it's your decision, right? And especially if you've got an outsourced PR agency, marketing agency, whatever, they should be practicing this with rigor. You should be asking them for this kind of stuff, right? What's pitching? It's kind of, yeah, it's this guy. Always be closing. Alec Baldwin. Has everyone seen this? Glengarry Glen Ross? Yeah. This is the side that you might like write off, be like, whatever, it's just sales. Sales matters, right? Even if you're the salesperson, right? If you don't close that deal, you ain't got that revenue, and you're in any kind of business-to-business context. If you're in a B2C context, probably not as directly relevant, then you're thinking more about the marketing funnel and conversion points. I am at Salesforce. Oh my God, do I think about sales all the time. You need to enable your sales team to be successful as a product manager. That means you give them demos that they can run of the product. You train the trainers, right? Make sure that everyone, sometimes sales does certification programs. You give them scripts, right? And again, it may not be you writing the script. It might be the marketer writing the script, right? If you're in a luxury environment like us, we've got sales enablement resources that write the scripts, right? But everyone knows it needs to know what's your positioning, what's your messaging, how do you go to market with consistency? Because if you don't go to market with consistency, you have no idea what you're going to change to get better results. If your message isn't resonating, if your positioning isn't resonating, you got to change it. And then incentives. Oh my God, incentives. So in our environment, incentives are absolutely crucial, right? And so much of it comes down to, spiffs, which is like an extra reward, right? Or like certain promotions or discounting or whatever it is that helps that sales team end up achieving their objective. And if they achieve their objective, then you achieve your objective. And of course, that's kind of just the beginning. What about support, right? Even if you're an entrepreneur, you're doing your own support. You have to enable those people to understand what's going into the product, how do they address it, right? Issues coming back. For the launch we just did on Monday, we have a whole document. It's like, here's anticipated questions that you might come in and see. They took time to actually write preordained responses that they put into their macro templates and their case systems, et cetera, right? So that these people are successful. It's all about enablement and bringing them on board. What about documentation? Right? Are you going to have documentation for your product? The more documentation you have, the less support volume you can have, right? If your documentation is fantastic. This is MailChimp's strategy, or our neighbor to the south at Pond City Market. They have millions of customers, which is unbelievable, their scale. They're almost all long tail single businesses. How could they possibly run that profitably? They focus enormously on design, editing stuff down, and documentation so people can help themselves. And so they don't go down a path where they're like, get stuck and they're confused, right? And they can scale. And then there can be all different other constituent groups. You think about your partnerships, right? That can get to channel strategy. Who's selling? Maybe you've got reseller partners. Maybe you've got implementation consultants, et cetera. How do you keep them on board? How do you make sure that they know what you're doing, et cetera? So, what is product management and what do PMs do exactly? This is the framework for 101. I'm sure we could do 102s, 103s, and 104s and go deeper into any aspect of it. That is my deck. There is going to be a survey coming to you tomorrow in email. So I greatly appreciate if you all could respond to that and give me feedback so I can iterate on this if I ever do it again. But yeah, what other questions do you have? Anything is fair game. Thank you. That was long, I know. Will the deck be attached to the email? Yes, JC says. Yes.
So for early stage startups, how important would you say documentation is? And then who would you say runs with that process? Product manager or the engineer? How do they collaborate?
Early stage startups is whoever you can. Who do you have, right? How important is it? How complex is your product? Like, are people going to like stub their toe over here and get confused over here, right? If your product is incredibly simple and straightforward, maybe you don't need as much documentation, right? With Salesforce, our whole value proposition is you can do anything with this product. You can transform it in a million different ways. It's unbelievably complex. You're going to need a lot of documentation to try to take volume away from support and provide a good user experience. No? Sure.
I was kind of confused. I didn't understand the inverse pattern between documentation versus support.
Yeah.
And, like, how that.
I mean, it fundamentally comes down to, and I mean, support, this is a whole nother talk. You could do an entire session on just these things, right? If you're a customer and you're using a product and you get stuck, what do you do? That's all it comes down to, right? And as a product manager or an entrepreneur, you have to decide what are the channels I'm going to give to this customer when they get stuck and they just don't know what to do, right? And your options on the standard menu are going to be great documentation. How much does that cost you? It costs you what it takes to write the frickin' article, right? It's very low. Email support, how much does that cost you? That's gonna have a cost. And then you start to think about like, okay, what's my throughput? How many cases do I solve, et cetera. Chat support, that's really gonna have a cost. Phone support, you gotta be freaking crazy. You're gonna outsource to a call center, right? I mean, like you can do any of those things. Depending on the business, you might be in a business where you need to have phone support right off the bat. But man, you better plan that into your economics, you're gonna get killed. Yeah.
Do you think whether for new product managers and working at kind of startups or growing SaaS companies that don't really have processes in place to take agile classes or to learn more
Yeah.
about agile?
Should new product managers take agile classes? Absolutely. If you haven't done it, just do it. Just bite the bullet, get certified. I mean, there's a million people out there who will be happy to certify you for a fee. And just learn the process. First, you learn the kind of like, that's getting the religion. And then you actually have to put it into practice and you'll start feeling like what works, what doesn't, where does it start breaking down? The reality of it is way messier than what they tell you, right? But that's something you have to internalize and figure out what works for your team. Other questions? Okay, thank you so much. I don't think we're losing the room, so I might do a little post-game segment for anyone who wants to stick around, but at this point, I will not be offended if you want to leave. So thank you so much for coming.